Hello, it's Wednesday, the 4th of April, 2018 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators in higher education. I'm your host, Heather Shea, broadcasting live from Michigan State University. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. In a moment, I will introduce the 5 panelists joining me today to talk about the newest volume of the book, How College Affects Students. But before I do that, I need to give a quick thanks to those who make these free webcasts possible. Today's episode is sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover other opportunities, including the upcoming Student Affairs Assessment Institute, sponsored by the Commission for Assessment and Evaluation. This year's institute, held in Chicago, Illinois, from June 20th through the 22nd, provides a guided curricular experience where participants can develop essential assessment knowledge and skills for their professional toolkit. You can learn more by visiting the link we are tweeting out now. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. You can be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Thanks to my friend and colleague, Erica Thompson, for monitoring today's back channel. For those of you watching live today, if you have questions for our panelists, please tweet at the hashtag #HigherEdLive, and we will do our best to incorporate them into the discussion. Tony Duty, my brilliant friend and co-host on Student Affairs Live, and I broadcast approximately twice a month on Wednesdays at 1, and all of our past episodes are free and easy to access in our video archives, or you can take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. In partnership with the National Resource Center for College and University Admissions, M. Stoner's myth-busting enrollment marketing research uncovers the best marketing channels and communication preferences that have the biggest influence on prospective students' perceptions of your institution. M. Stoner's white paper is available for on-demand download, and you can get your copy today and identify what encourages prospective students to apply to your institution. We're tweeting out a link shortly. Now on with today's episode. So I'm thrilled to be joined by the 5 co-authors of the newest volume of How College Affects Students. We who work in student affairs and higher education face intense scrutiny on several fronts, and in our roles, we must have working knowledge of college impact and the metrics that prove what we do matters. Initially compiled by Ernest Pasquarella and Patrick Terenzini, the book How College Affects Students has long been the reference for educators, administrators, researchers, and policymakers. And today we're going to be talking specifically about the findings from 2002 to 2013, which builds upon decades of research. So I'd like to welcome the 5 authors: Dr. Matthew Mayhew from The Ohio State University, Dr. Alyssa Rockenbach from North Carolina State University, Dr. Nicholas Bowman from the University of Iowa, Dr. Tricia Seifert from Montana State University, and Dr. Gregory Wolniak from New York University. Thank you all for being here today. And as each of you give us a little bit more of an introduction, besides working on this book, what else would you like to share about your work, scholarship, and interests? And then if you'd like, presumably each of you also have your own complex story of the many ways college affected you and led to your career. So if there's one thing in the book that resonated with your own experience, I'd love to hear about that as well. So Matt, we're gonna start with you today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for organizing this wonderful opportunity to speak to you today on behalf of a book where the 5 of us really poured our heart into for about 5 years and expressed oftentimes our frustrations with the writing effort through tears. So it's nice to come together in a joyful moment to talk to you about some of the findings from the book. As Heather mentioned, my name is Matt Mayhew. I'm a professor at The Ohio State University. I study college and its effects on students, more specifically how institutional conditions and educational practices influence a variety of student learning and democratic outcomes, such as interfaith learning and innovation capacities, financial wellness. Those are some of the areas recently that I've been diving into. When Heather asked for a personal anecdote, I got a little worried because, you know, as faculty, we can talk about ourselves a whole lot. I will say this, from college, I was a resident advisor. And I remember the importance and the power of having very good experiences with staff and the educators around me in teaching me the things that I didn't necessarily learn in the classroom. And those lessons about leadership, about who I was in the context of being a leader, became really important and paramount for me as I was thinking about my future career trajectories. Before I pass it on, my pronouns, I go by he, him, and hers. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, co-curricular experiences, I imagine, will be a common theme among many of us, and certainly that's my story as well, having been an RA. Alyssa, welcome.
Thank you so much, Heather. My name is Alyssa Rockenbach, and I'm a professor of higher education at NC State University. And broadly speaking, my areas of interest have to do with the college student experience and college impact. But kind of within that broader domain, I'm very interested in looking at college students' religious and spiritual experiences and how aspects of campus climate shape some of that development that we see among our students. I'm also very interested in campus equity issues, particularly in terms of gender equity and LGBT equity on campus. Matt and I worked together on a project called the Interfaith Diversity Experiences and Attitudes Longitudinal Survey, or IDEALS. In terms of my teaching, I teach quantitative research methods at NC State, college student outcomes, and courses on spirituality in higher education and gender issues. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. In terms of an anecdote, I was thinking about my years in college. I was a psychology major, and in exploring psychological issues, I really was seeking a way to kind of apply the theory that I was learning and make it useful. And I was really interested in students' kind of personal development, kind of emerging adulthood issues around identity. And it was really serendipitous that I got to know a faculty member who was directing the student affairs program at my college. And though I knew very little at the time about social science research, being only a junior, she invited me to be a part of her graduate research team. And that was such a wonderful experience for me, and it actually led to my first opportunity to present at a conference at NASPA. And so being a part of that project, I think, really resonates with some of what we find in the book, that having mentors who inspire you, who believe in you, and having undergraduate research experiences can help lead to your career choices.
Undergraduate research, another common theme. Tricia, welcome.
Thank you. I'm an associate professor at Montana State University in the Adult and Higher Education program, and currently I also serve as the department head of education. My research interests largely are also in this college impact domain, and I'm looking at the relationship between college and organizational structures and cultures and how those support student success. So I have a project called the Supporting Student Success Study, a multi-institutional study across Canada that looks at faculty members and staff members' perceptions of their institution's retention efforts. I've also started to really look at how we help first-year students and those who are in high school learn the hidden curriculum before they even arrive on our campus. And I'm doing some work with games, board games, and virtual games to help demystify the hidden curriculum before students matriculate on our campuses. I think like everyone, I had so many rich experiences as a college student myself. I was a president of our student government, and as such had an opportunity to go to NASPA as an undergraduate student. And even though I was there, it didn't fully hit me that this was a profession, that this was a field of study that I could make an entire career out of. And so it makes me wonder, how do we as mentors continuously clearly communicate that if this is the kind of work you're interested in, there's a lifetime and a career of opportunities ahead.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Nick, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Nick Bowman. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I teach in the Higher Education Student Affairs program here at the University of Iowa. Courses I teach include the college student, the impact of college on students, survey research and design, and teaching and learning in higher education. In general, my research uses some of my social psychology training. I have half my PhD is in social psych. So I study a whole bunch of stuff, including issues of college diversity, student success, quantitative research methods, college rankings, and college admissions. My experiences actually in getting into this actually overlap a fair bit with Alyssa's. I was also a psych major as an undergrad as well as an education minor. And I was fortunate enough to be able to have some pretty decent both research experiences and teaching experiences, and wanted, a way, given that I liked both of those things, knowing that a faculty career was the direction to go. I also similarly, I liked the psychology side, but at the same time wanted to be able to apply that to some real world setting, and thinking about college students and how they enter and succeed and learning college is the way that I've done that. So thanks.
Thanks for being here, Nick. Greg.
Yeah, thanks,
Welcome.
Heather. It's always a pleasure to share the stage, or the webcast in this case, with this group. Going last is always difficult because it's such a impressive stories we hear, and great group. But anyway, I'll do my best. I'm Greg Wolniak. I work at NYU, where I direct the Center for Research on Higher Education Outcomes. I'm also a faculty member in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program. Broadly speaking, my research really delves into the socioeconomic impacts of higher education. And the way I kind of focus my research attention within that fairly large domain is in trying to understand points of transition. So factors that influence students as they transition into the system, things like attitudes, aspirations, understanding of financial aid, financial literacy, how institutions communicate costs and financial information back to students. And then on the other side, transitions out, how experiences and forms of engagement within the college environment influence students' careers and economic trajectories. So that's really where my research focuses, and has for many years. My teaching kind of runs the spectrum from kind of topical classes around economics and finance of higher education and enrollment management, to really broad classes related to just the basics of research design, to the impacts of college on students. On a personal note, it's really hard not to think of your own experiences as you're working your way through these 700 plus pages. For me, just briefly, I had two big concerns or motivations when I was in college. One was, I'm happy to say, truly was academics. I actually cared about learning and figuring out what was the right major for me. The second was athletics. I attended at one of these big Division I kind of state universities. In many cases, I cared as much, if not more, about academic or athletic performance as I did about academic performance. But those were the two really strong motivators. So similar to all the others here on the panel, I really had this blended kind of dual purpose or sources of motivation that drove my own development of self-concept, whether it's academically, socially, and occasionally in leadership opportunities.
Great. So many similar things, which I think will bode as we speak further about this, and certainly apply to our audience today. Assuming, however, that our audience is familiar with the book, but maybe hasn't picked up the latest volume, Tricia, can you start by giving our audience an overview of how all different types of folks who work in higher ed might use this book, and maybe start first with our audience of student affairs educators, then we'll move on to others.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually often take this book with me when I'm speaking on campus, when I'm at committee meetings, because I really think it's the first place to begin. It's the first place I used to begin when I wanted to be research informed and understand what the evidence base suggested in terms of linking a college experience with a desired outcome. And so as our student affairs divisions are pushed and encouraged to create really well-articulated learning outcomes and linking those with experiences, I think the book is sort of the beginning place. And I often say, go read that section in How College Affects Students. If you're interested in the effects of a living learning community on cognitive growth and development or student attitudes, go see what How College Affects Students says in terms of the summary, and then take those research articles that are referenced and see who's researched and cited them since. Use a Google Scholar search to see this was published in 2012. Who cited that same article in the last 6 years? And so I think it's the starting point for really have research-informed theory to practice-based work in student affairs divisions.
Great. Tricia mentioned some ways that scholars might find other resources, but Alyssa, as a faculty member, what are the ways that other scholars and researchers can use this book in their studies?
Yeah, I think similar to what Tricia mentioned, this book can be kind of a first place to start. So for those who are interested in kind of engaging a new area of research, whether they're faculty or students who are working on dissertations, I think this can be a useful source to kind of get the lay of the land on a particular topic. So, essentially, what is it that we know about those issues? Who might be some of the key players that are conducting research on those topics? And importantly, what are some of the questions that still need to be addressed? I think that this book tells us a lot about what we know, but it also kind of opens the door to what we don't know and what we still need to continue to explore. And so I think researchers can use this book to kind of build an argument around a new question or problem and use that to kind of build on the work that's come before.
Greg, your area working with policymakers, can you talk a little bit about how folks who are shaping policy or seeking to understand higher ed policy might refer to this text?
Yeah, I spent, I guess, about as much time working in policy kind of research or applied research organizations as I have been in academia. And what I noticed from that experience is, policymakers in applied research oftentimes need to be generalists. They need to know a little bit about a lot of things. It's kind of different than what we as faculty members do, where we go really deep into a kind of a more narrowly defined set of topics. And so really echoing both Tricia and Alyssa, it's an incredibly kind of efficiency that you gain from working with this book. You might be called upon to put together a quick summary of what, for example, we know about first-year student experiences or programs that seem to help students during their first year of college. And you can quickly go to the index and kind of synthesize at least what a handful of good empirical studies have pointed to in terms of drivers of student success. So in that sense, it's just an incredible time saver. It drives efficiency. It helps then kind of move the conversation more quickly forward to understanding really where the evidence lies empirically. But even beyond policymakers and some applied researchers, this book has a lot of meaning for even folks who do high school to college counseling or admissions counselors. A lot of people care about getting kind of the returns on their investment, so to speak, making sure that the experience is in fact as good as it can be at a particular institution. And other not-for-profit agencies that might sponsor college student support programs of any nature. There's almost always an evaluation or at least a thoughtful assessment attached to those. And this book can inform those efforts as well.
Great. So Nick, I know, well, all of you, in chapter 1, you name the many ways that the 4 words comprising the title, How College Affects Students, have taken on new meaning. Can you briefly review for us the changes in these base words and how that kind of provides some context for the approach of this text? I'll start with Nick and then we'll pass it around.
Yeah, so we're each going to take a word here. It's first of all starting off with how the word how has changed from previous volumes. So a lot of the earlier work, particularly in volume 1, which reviewed literature from the 70s and 80s, was focused on whether or not college had some sort of impact on students, and by and large it does in many different ways. So as we move more toward our volume 3, the focus has become not so much whether, but why does it matter and when or for whom does it matter? So focusing, a little bit more, I guess, deeply on those aspects of how. Another important aspect is that there are a lot more theories and frameworks that are proposed for understanding college impact. And, some of these are specific to specific types of outcomes or specific groups of students. So in trying to do this, we actually tie the beginning of each of the chapter, instead of having that as a separate chapter within each chapter, we sort of said, here are the theories and frameworks that are most relevant to these particular set of outcomes.
I found that to be really useful as well. Tricia, college, the word college, what does that mean today?
Well, college used to mean sort of a program of study at a single point in time for a duration of 2 to 4 years, depending on the degree one was seeking at a single institution. And we know that today that doesn't constitute all that many students because they're attending multiple institutions at the same time. They're transferring between institutions. And so what exactly is college? And then we also added in another component that was new in this volume by including scholarship that was conducted in contexts outside of the United States. And so college, the word college in other contexts, means totally different types of institutions. Whereas in the US, we use the word college to refer to both 2-year and 4-year institutions. In Canada, where I previously worked, colleges were largely 1-year, 2-year, or 3-year non-degree granting institutions. Now that's changing some, but they're generally credentials of a sub-baccalaureate sort. And so what is college and who goes to college really has varied over time and is context specific. And we expand on that in the book.
Excellent. Affect. How does college affect students? What are the ways that word has changed, Alyssa?
So what constitutes an effect has really been scrutinized more, I think, in recent years. So as scholars in our field and in other fields have moved toward more experimental types of designs or quasi-experimental designs, we're really asking those questions about, can we use that kind of causal language? So we have to be really cautious about making those kinds of claims. And so we were thoughtful about how to use the word effect or even the word influence. And there were times, depending on the research design, where we would use other words. We might say this experience was related to or associated with this particular outcome if it wasn't clear from the design that we could use the terms cause and effect. We also used developmental language whenever that was warranted. So we might say things like, this particular educational experience helps students to make cognitive gains. And with the way that we think about effects, we also try to keep the focus in the book on college impact. So we look specifically at relationships between educational experiences and outcomes, rather than on other types of relationships. For instance, the relationship between student characteristics and outcomes, or between student characteristics and experiences that students were engaging in. So in the end, we just tried to be really thoughtful about the language to make sure that we were aligning the way that we reported findings with the research design of individual studies.
Great, thanks. And certainly students are very different today. Greg, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's the short end of it. But it really is where we see the evolving and dynamic nature of the higher education system. Women outnumber men. There's an dramatic increase in adult learners. In essence, it's a more racially, culturally, and religiously diverse student body than we've ever seen historically.
Right. So Nick, assessing quality, how does a study make it into this book? Talk to us a little bit about your methods there.
Yeah, so 2 parts. So the first part of that is, how does it make it into the book in the first place? And it's important to note that the literature has really expanded here in the 21st century. So one of several ways that we identified studies in the first place is doing a complex keyword search of saying, oh, well, it's got these terms and the title or abstract, et cetera, et cetera. So I created one of these that looked during the period of, our review. And then I'm like, just for fun, let me look at what that looks like if we do the same search, but look at volume 2, which that review period for volume 2 is actually, they included like 1 more year. But at the same time, volume 3, more than twice as many hits for potential studies came up. And so we said, oh, wow, we need some sort of way of limiting, to like, how do we identify the studies that are the most relevant or the most high quality? And so one of the things that we did is we restricted almost exclusively studies that had undergone some sort of peer review process. There were some exceptions, and particularly for influential reports and things of that sort. But that was one of the main criteria that we used in this. We considered somewhere, we don't have an exact count, but probably at least 10,000 different studies for potential inclusion. And we and our research assistants went through many of these, or all of these. And in terms of ones that we actually ended up citing in the book, we included 1,848 studies. At least for my end, that wasn't necessarily even everything that fit with the chapter. There were, say for financial aid, about 75 studies looking at financial aid and retention, persistence, graduation. So I didn't cite every single one of those, just included the ones that, were either the strongest studies and or the ones that kind of shed particular insight into kind of how and when financial aid was influential. So that's one piece getting into this next. But then when we wrote, we wanted to place greater emphasis on the highest quality studies, the ones that were most trustworthy, and make the strongest conclusions based on those. So I had a few different ways of doing that. One of them is we wanted to use studies with a design that drew the strongest conclusion, as Alyssa notes, where you can really use the word effect most meaningfully. And so it's not often, but there were certainly studies that we reviewed, particularly around teaching and learning, that randomly assigned students to exposure to certain types of experiences and other students to not have those experiences. And so those are the ones where we can draw the strongest conclusions. So we placed greater weight on those. Also, for many of the chapters, we really cared about change over time. And so in that case, we really wanted studies that were longitudinal. So you've got the pre-test, you've got the post-test, and so you can make conclusions about change as opposed to just looking at people, in their first year or their third year and without looking at where students started in the first place. Another thing we valued was studies that were more generalizable in terms of having multiple institutions within their samples so that, some of the dynamics wouldn't be specific to one particular institution. Some others that are a little more straightforward is, value ones that conducted sort of appropriate analyses. So if the data had students within institutions, do you account for that appropriately? Ones that included, sort of the more trustworthy measures of college experiences and outcomes. As well, whenever possible, it was also nice that when some studies were able to look at sort of the process, that like this experience might lead to some intermediate thing, which then leads to some, kind of main outcome of interest. And so we placed greater attention on studies that could shed some of those additional insights into that.
Right. So given the volume and the comprehensive nature of this book, it seems like that gives us some cause for the reason why the subtitle of this book is different, right? Like we need 21st century evidence that higher education works. And the first sentence of chapter 1 reads that the purpose and value of higher education is under fire. So Matt, we know that a college education matters, those of us who work here. But what changes did you find that might be on the horizon with a shifting political landscape? And how does this book and the research summarized in this book help us make a stronger case that college matters?
That's a great question. I think, Americans tend to think with their wallets, whether that's a fortunate or an unfortunate way of going about making sense of the world around them. So we know that one of the motivating factors for folks to show up to vote is how they're doing economically. And one of the ways that folks have kind of expressed that in terms of thinking about college education is what they think about the value and purpose of education is often wrapped in how they're thinking about how much money college actually costs. And affordability is a huge issue in higher education, and it's something that we really need to get a handle on. And there's a lot of research in thinking about how to make college more affordable, right? And so because college has become so expensive, folks, I think, in the country are starting to question, is it worth it? Is college actually worth the investment? And what we're trying to say in this book is, not only is it worth the investment economically, not only is it worth the investment in terms of, quality of life indicators far beyond college, but when you're in college, you're actually learning what you need to learn. You'd be hard pressed to find anybody who is a caretaker of anybody send their person when they're sick to somebody who doesn't have a college degree, at least to some degree. The folks who are coming to college to learn their chemistry are learning their chemistry. The folks who are coming to college to learn their accounting are learning their accounting, right? They know accounting, they know their numbers, they know their math, they know the science, they know their literature base far beyond what a high school graduate knows. And so there is this way that I think we need to consistently make the claim that college is working. And so I think that because of the way that the landscape politically is trying to shape the narrative, we're able to say, you know what, yes, affordability is an issue. Yes, issues of access are really important to understand. But once students come to us, we do a good job at giving them and equipping them with what they need to be effective citizens in society, at least as the data in this book suggest. Now, we have to keep in mind, of course, right, that we reviewed articles from about 2002 to 2013. And sometimes it takes a very long time for work to go from an original idea into print, into the status that we can actually look at for review. So some of the data provided in the book are actually from data collection efforts maybe in the 90s. So we may see in the next generation of scholarship, we might not see as profound effects in terms of thinking about economic indicators of success for college going. But at least as far as this book is concerned, we are able to say on every measure, I mean, we have more work to do, quite frankly, with particular practices, and we can talk about that as we move on here. But at the end of the day, we are able to actually say, yes, we do have evidence here that college is working.
Great. So we've had several fabulous questions from Twitter, so I want to thank those of you who are following along and asking great questions. We're going to try to incorporate those as we go through kind of some summaries of the findings and help folks who are watching kind of understand, you know, based on your experiences, what are the things that you learned as you reviewed both what had been written before as well as what you reviewed with this particular group. But I wanted to just jump back really quickly and ask if one of you could answer the question by Kevin Guidry. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Kevin. Did you all focus solely or primarily on secondary literature, meta studies, or high quality review? Who would like to kind of take that?
I can talk about that. So we did, in some cases, when they were available, when they were strong quantitative meta-analyses or qualitative syntheses of the literature, we definitely drew on those. So, you know, sometimes to get an overall idea of it, and also as a starting place to identify additional research. And especially even when we didn't rely on them in great detail, you know, we tried whenever possible to refer readers and to say, hey, for review, see, et cetera, et cetera. And this consisted with some of our earlier comments about using it as a starting place, because we wanted to point these out not just for the purposes of our review, but also so that people who are really interested in more detail in these topics, you know, because we don't have enough space to go into oodles of detail for everything, but pointing people in that direction.
Great. So if I understand correctly how you all kind of divided up the work of the book and took responsibility for sections, I'd love to hear if you could, based on the experience you had writing your section and reviewing other work, if you could speak specifically about one thing you learned or a couple of things that you learned that you would like student affairs folks to know about the work you reviewed. So Alyssa, I'm going to start with you, and my understanding is that we will start with psychosocial changes that occur during college that are relevant to student affairs work.
Yeah, so the areas that I explored had to do with psychosocial development, and also I looked closely at attitudes and values. As you can imagine, that it was a pretty expansive set of outcomes that were included in those chapters. I mean, just to give you a sense of that, everything from identity formation to student self-understanding, their leadership skills, their attitudes toward diversity, sociopolitical attitudes, all kinds of things were found in those chapters. So it's challenging to decide what to focus on in providing some thoughts and reflections on what the literature had to say over the last decade. But there were two areas that I thought kind of really stood out to me. So I want to just comment briefly on those two. One, the first that I want to talk about is psychological well-being. So that was an area that really got increased attention in the last decade. And I think much of that attention reflects the fact that students are coming to college these days experiencing more or just reporting more mental challenges than they did in past decades. And what we saw in some of the longitudinal research was that a lot of those challenges are taking place, especially in the first year of college, that's where we're really seeing kind of that dip in mental health, and that the change from the first to the fourth year of college is a little bit more marginal in terms of that decline. So what is it? What is it that is having this kind of effect on students? What's making it better or worse for students? And a lot of the research talks about that it's really all about quality relationships with other students, with faculty, that students really need a strong support network. When relationships are negative in quality, when students are feeling unsafe or pressured by their peers, or they're having difficulty in the residence halls in some regard, that's when we see more of those kinds of emotional struggles. And it also turns out that identity is playing an important role here too. So for instance, one thing we know is that the gender gap in emotional health, with women having lower levels of well-being, that gender gap tends to widen during the college years. And we also know that students of marginalized identities, racial, sexual, and otherwise, are also reporting lower levels of well-being and experience those downward shifts to a greater degree during college. So there's a lot of potential reasons for this. I think one thing that really stood out though was issues around campus climate. So when we have tensions on campus, when there's experiences that students are having with discrimination, that tends to result in higher levels of anxiety and depression for students, particularly of certain identities. So that's one area that I wanted to talk about. The other area that really stood out to me in the review was the effect of diversity experiences on campus. And I think this is so important, especially for student affairs educators to think about, because a lot of our diversity efforts on campus are being scrutinized as of late, and our literature base is so strong in terms of the strong effects of different kinds of diversity experiences that we see among students. And diversity attitudes are certainly affected by that kind of exposure, but it's all kinds of things. So across the board in the chapters I worked on, whether it's curricular diversity, experiences that co-curricular kinds of programming that students are having around diversity, or even kind of the informal things, interactional diversity. These experiences are affecting everything from students' academic self-concept, their leadership development, their well-being, their civic and political attitudes, and so forth. So it really kind of across the board, that kind of exposure is having an impact. We know that effects tend to be stronger the more diversity exposure that students have, and that it's a lot more about the quality of those experiences, not just how often they're happening. So it's not just the frequency of those experiences. And it really depends on the type of interaction that students are having in terms of the effect that we see. So for certain outcomes, it's the informal stuff, it's the interactional kinds of experiences that students are having that really yield some of those positive gains. And one example of that is students' attitudes toward LGBTQ people. It's about knowing someone, it's about having a relationship that really yields those kinds of positive attitudes.
Great, thanks so much. Greg, tell us a little bit about what you found regarding career and economic impacts of college.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and we have limited time. So I'm going to focus specifically on where most of the evidence seems to exist, and that's in relationship to post-college earnings. So there's a lot of outcomes we look at in discussing the career and economic influences of college. Earnings is not by any means the most important one to focus on, but it is where the evidence is the strongest and where, frankly, we get, I would say, the most questions from folks outside of academia. People care, as Matt mentioned, a lot about where their money goes and what it turns into from an investment standpoint. And here we really see some striking evidence from this past decade of work. We see that, for example, per every year of college completed, an individual makes on average 5% more post-college. That's immediately after college, and that increases over time and almost doubles over the next decade or so post-college. When you start to think about degrees or credential completion, we see at, say, the vocational or associate's degree level, we see somewhere in the order of 3 to 7% or so earnings effects of those credentials. In terms of bachelor's degree, that jumps up from anywhere from 15 to almost 27% across different studies that we reviewed. These ranges we report are necessary because different studies use different methods for defining when earnings were collected and different aspects of the study design. So we're trying to create a range to give you the best feel for what the evidence suggests. And of course, graduate degrees create substantial earnings differences, but that really changes a lot depending on what the field of study is or the particular degree, whether it's a master's, an MBA, a PhD, a law degree, for example. But of course, we have to think carefully about costs. We know that costs are a major concern these days, have been for decades. And there too, when we look at the literature where folks have really rigorously taken into account all of the costs, the direct costs like tuition, but also the indirect costs like foregone employment earnings during college, we still see that a return on investment, the kind of metric you can compare to other potential investments you can make in our world, we see that higher education yields a 15 to 20% return on investment. It tends to be closer to 20% for people who go to public schools because the costs are lower. Tends to be closer to 15% for folks who go to private schools because costs are more. Nevertheless, that's a pretty substantial return on investment by most people's standards. If I knew for sure there was an investment that would yield that rate of return, I would seriously consider putting some resources into it. So that's, I think, notable. Another really notable piece of evidence from this work is the profound influence of college major. In fact, deciding your major plays a bigger role in determining your career earnings than does where you go to school or even if you go to school. So let me put this another way. Whether what you decide to study as your major actually has a bigger impact on your future earnings than the decision whether to even go to college. So we see the reason for that is there are upwards of 40 to 50% difference in earnings across majors. Which is quite staggering, right? So in the book, we talk a bit about the high earning majors, the lower earning majors. We talk a bit about the research that suggests why that may be. And there's also a kind of an interesting, somewhat blessing, somewhat curse of a finding to show that it's not just what you major in, but landing a job that's closely related to your major amplifies those earnings effects of a degree. So if you study a lower earning degree and you work in that field, you'll have even lower earnings. And if you study something at the very high end of the earnings distribution and you land a job closely related to your degree. Nevertheless, helping students find employment within their field it has huge economic implications. Let's see. The last thing I'm going to say is that, and before I let the others weigh in, when we talk a lot about these statistics and percent changes in earnings and whatnot, an important thing to keep in mind is these are really conservative estimates. We're talking about individual, so private individual returns that we can count in monetary ways. These don't take into account the non-monetary benefits of a college education, like better health over time. These don't take into consideration the social or public benefits of a college education. And so it's really important to take this into account. We found one study that we reference in the book that looked to examine simply tax revenues from college graduates relative to government expenditures on higher education and found a social monetary return on investment upwards of 10%. So that's really important, I think, in kind of this narrative around what higher education specifically is doing as an engine of kind of economic growth.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Greg. Tricia, talk to us a little bit about what evidence you found related to competency gains as well as quality of life, how college affects quality of life.
So I often talk about the book in terms of it brings us as faculty members and as student affairs professionals to really bringing our A game. And the A game is active and applied. It's what you do to make that course content come to life. And this actually goes back into other literature that says when we practice deliberately that which we're studying, we will learn more about it. And of course, that makes complete sense. It's guided in learning theory from hundreds of years ago. But our colleges and universities are not always set up in the most active and applied environments. You can think about the 100 student or the 500 student lecture hall where there's a sage on the stage talking through a PowerPoint, or not even using a PowerPoint and just lecturing for 2.5 hours. That is definitively and experimentally demonstrated to not be the most effective learning space. Not a shock, but I think that this really provides the evidence for student affairs folks who are working in these active and applied spaces, working with faculty members in service learning and in co-ops and in internships, helping people make those connections and then reflect on their learning in terms of the content that they're learning in the courses. You think about all of the work that happens in student union buildings, from marketing and promotions and business and communications, and all of this is a petri dish, a setting for students to think about what they're learning in a classroom and apply it, reflect on it, and make even greater gains. So that's where I think we need to go and really commit as a higher education enterprise, is to really think creatively about active and applied learning environments for all subject matter. What did we learn about, as Greg mentioned, there are more than just economic benefits to going to college. This is where the actual college impact literature around between college effects or within college effects is really nascent. Most of the research study that I reviewed compares those who have attended and completed college for those who didn't. And so what we know from that is that there is pervasive better health outcomes, and both self-assessed as well as living longer. And this is not a surprise, because people, even controlling for income, people with a college education choose healthier lifestyles by and large, and have the cognitive ability to make sense of pretty complex health-related information. And so that informs their behavior. We also know from the literature that there's improved welfare for one's children. College-educated people, compared to those who have a high school degree, read to their kids at a greater rate. They have more books. They have more sort of a broader sort of cultural milieu for students, their children, to interact. They also engage civically and politically at a higher level. One areas where we are starting to see some examination of how college affects civic engagement is particularly around major. And when it comes to major, the STEM areas and business majors tend to, on average, have lower civic engagement and lower political participation than their peers in education and in the social sciences. And so I think that this is important, because those are the majors that have seen the greatest uptick in terms of students pursuing science, technology, engineering, math, and business. It's certainly the case on my campus. And so I think we need to consider how will higher education realize the mandate and our longstanding value of educating people who will engage civically in our democracy.
Thanks so much. Nick, talk to us a little bit about what you learned regarding educational attainment and persistence. What was the literature that you found related to student affairs on that?
So I want to talk about some of a couple big themes that cut across a lot of findings, given the time that we have. The first one found that if you pair some sort of academic initiative, so something like a first-year seminar, living learning program, something like that, and pair it with some form of student services, whether this be, mentoring, advising, tutoring, et cetera, those interventions that intentionally put those pieces together had some pretty sizable positive effects on student retention, persistence, and graduation. Interestingly, when you looked at those same experiences separately, some of which fall into, we'll talk in a little bit about the high impact practices. If you had something that was a very standalone, here's a first year seminar, it's by itself, it's not really connected to anything else, bare bones version, those tended not to be particularly effective or effective at all in promoting retention. So has some very interesting implications for partnerships with faculty and practitioners, whether in student affairs or academic affairs, to really think, how can we work collectively to solve problems and make it so students don't have to go all over campus to find all these various resources, but they can work in one sort of integrated student success intervention that's kind of designed for them. So that's one theme. Another theme is consistently looking at the different ways of promoting social adjustment and engagement and how these promote retention. And this could take a number of different forms. If you're looking at the quality of relationships that people have, if you're looking at, say, the impact of living on campus, which tends to promote those relationships, which then tend to promote retention. If you're looking at campus climate defined either narrowly or broadly, in that, like these sorts of ways, the more that you can get students really involved with some less strong evidence, but also around campus student organizations as potentially having positive effects, that these seem to be related to retention and persistence. The final point, and this addresses a couple of questions that we've gotten online, is about sort of how generalizable are these effects, particularly for different groups of students. And at least for my chapter, or this chapter here, the effects were pretty similar across, whether you're talking about by race, by gender, or sex, or socioeconomic status, and so on. There are a couple of notable exceptions, and these exceptions shouldn't be surprising. As you might expect, financial aid tends to be more influential for students who have the greatest financial need. And therefore, that's the thing that really decides whether or not they can stay in college or not. Similarly, campus racial climate tends to be more strongly related to retention for students of color who often face the negative climates associated with that.
Matt, you are last in our list of different chapter sections. Can you talk a little bit about the cognitive, intellectual, and moral development findings from the book in like a minute?
Oh, wow. That's awesome, Heather. Thank you so much for giving me a minute to talk about all things critical thinking, cognitive development. Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to go rogue here. And if I say anything incorrectly, you have my colleague's email address, so just email them. So I think academic challenge is huge. Okay, students have to experience academic challenge when they come to college campuses. And in first year programs, what we have started to see is that if students aren't experiencing these first year seminars as academically challenging, they have less profound of an effect. So students who are enrolling for the first time in their college class, in a class where the first 3 months is about learning how to use their email effectively, or walking to the library, or other things like that, those aren't necessarily the components of what we would say would be an academically challenging environment. There is some research to suggest what a challenging curriculum for first year programs would look like. And if pedagogically effective, you can use email as an entry point or as an assessment way, or as a way of kind of illuminating that academic content, right? There are ways to rethink those transitional issues that we know are important for students to learn, especially first-gen students. There are ways to really innovate in those spaces to make sure that students are learning those lessons without compromising the challenge that should come with rigorous coursework. Okay, so students need to feel like they're academically challenged to make a lot of gains in terms of the critical and moral spaces. And I think the second piece, really quickly, I know you didn't give me a lot of time, is what does it mean to be a highly impactful practitioner? Okay, this high impact practice term needs to go away, because the weight of the evidence constantly contradicts itself. There's no one silver bullet practice that any practitioner could put on campus and say, aha, we got it. Or a checklist, look at all of us, look at all these practices. It's about the practitioner. Is there a practitioner in place who can put an advising system, like Nick was talking about, bring a lot of good thinking together to really motivate students to move from the first year to the next all the way through? Are there people in different programmatic spaces who know how to productively facilitate cross-race interactions or interactions across religious differences. And those are the kinds of ideas these highly impactful practitioners need to take on in any programmatic space. And if they don't know how to do it, they need to learn, because the research is now so nuanced as to suggest that if students are experiencing negative practices in these spaces, they aren't learning, or they're retreating from learning. And so I think these are kind of important lessons to take forward, especially in thinking about the book and its implications on student affairs.
Excellent. I know it was more than a minute, but you did a good job of meshing together multiple questions. So thanks. We're going to move to final thoughts, actually, because I'd like for us to extend the learning for the folks who are watching today. So in your final thoughts, talk a little bit about one thing you'd like folks to take away from this episode. And if you have a resource or a specific website or professional development activity that you'd like to share that will help students kind of continue this conversation outside, you can share that during your final thought as well. And I think we're going to start with Tricia. Do you want to start first, Tricia?
Sure. I think what I take away from this conversation is that it's not about the practice, it's about the people who are doing it. And so the opportunity to train our folks, to see the opportunity for our own professional development and the chance to reach out and really partner meaningfully and not at the 11th hour with our faculty colleagues, but to bring them to the table so that they're part of the conversation as we initially research and as we begin to develop these practices, as we think through the implementation, inviting them to be part of the evaluation and the extent to which we can also interface that with their scholarship will help to break down what I think has been for too long, two staircases that meet at the top. And our students see these two silos, they see a divided house, they can't understand or make sense of it. Why can't we come together and say, it's not about the practice, it's not the awesome service learning, it's the people who are making the relationships and moving forward. And I'll pass it on.
All right, thanks so much. Nick, share your final thought with us.
So we got a little pushback in concluding, what are like the most impactful, practices across everything. But if you had to boil it down into two broad categories that seem to have a positive effect on lots and lots of different outcomes, those two areas are diversity experiences and good teaching. And there's a lot that student affairs practitioners can do in both of those areas, considering, good teaching is something that doesn't just happen in the classroom, but this sort of teaching and learning dynamic that can happen in various places, whether they be formal workshops or informal conversations or so on. So if you're thinking about, like the short version, I would also encourage people to use this, as we talked about at the beginning, as a resource. If you're like, hey, I want a starting place to think of, where do I go or what do we know about this? To head there.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. Matt, final thoughts?
Sure, I think I want to empower folks to empower the message that higher education works and use the book to think about that message, but also empower your own narrative as educators, okay? What does that mean for you? How are you consistently educating yourself with regard to what's working and what isn't? Is there time you're committing in your daily schedule and your weekly schedule to sit, to read, to think, to write up the great work that you're doing in ways that we can use to include in the next volume? How are you thinking about your time in those ways? So oftentimes, as a former student affairs practitioner, I understand this, we're so busy doing so many things, oftentimes putting out fires, that we don't build in the time just to think and the time to really empower ourselves to consistently remind our narrative that we are educators. And what does that mean? And how are we consistently nuancing our thinking and moving ourselves forward in those spaces?
Yeah, I think a future episode has to be how we become more effective scholar practitioners, blending those two skills and competencies together. Thanks so much, Matt. Greg.
Yeah, just a couple final thoughts, and really I'm going to echo the last two messages we heard. One of kind of this empowering findings that we have, and what Nick was describing. A really important resource that is provided by this book is not just thinking of within each chapter that's organized by an outcome area, but looking across chapters. And what Nick alluded to, I just want to reiterate because it's so both empowering for educators, but also important as a takeaway. The two types of things we found most predictive across the largest number of outcomes, developmental outcomes, were exposure to good teaching practices and exposure to diverse peers and dissimilar perspectives in the classroom. If that doesn't kind of capture your attention, then I don't know what will. Another really interesting thing is that that I didn't mention with respect to earnings is GPA drives earnings. So study up, kids. It actually has a dollar value attached to it. And I'll leave it at that. I know we have more to hear from Alyssa.
Great. Alyssa, finally, your thoughts.
Well, I think that what my hope is that what folks can take away from today is maybe an idea or some inspiration around a finding that they heard, that they can kind of think creatively about what this might mean for practice, because we've learned so much about college impact in the last decade, but now we really need to figure out what that means. And we really need the innovation of practitioners who are working directly with students. We need the insight that comes from the work that they're doing, and really take what we've learned empirically and shape that learning into practices that will really make a difference in students' lives.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you for your time today, for this fabulous resource for us, and also to Erica behind the scenes, who is tweeting many of your commentary throughout. And to all of you who are watching, I appreciate your comments and questions. We'll try to follow up in the back channel. Many of them we couldn't get to today. So I wanted to just give you a couple previews of future episodes. I'll be back in early May, speaking with Native American and Indigenous scholars about decolonization in higher education and student affairs. We'll be posting additional details about this episode in the coming weeks. Tony's also working on an episode for later in May, but you can save May 2nd for the episode on decolonization. And you can receive reminders about this and all of the episodes that we host by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter or browsing our archives again at higheredlive.com. Again, my name is Heather Shea. Thanks again to the fabulous panelists today, and to everybody who's watching. I hope everybody makes it a great week.